Hi, welcome to the Political Forum. Today is January 18th, 2021. Today is a federal holiday celebrating the life and legacy of Dr. King. In this group, we have an annual tradition of selecting certain speeches from Dr. King and discussing them. So in 2019, we read Letter from Birmingham Jail, and last year we read a speech entitled Beyond Vietnam. And tonight, we're also going to continue that tradition by reading the Promised Land speech, which is also dubbed as I've Been to the Mountaintop. So before we get into the actual text of the speech, which is really at the heart of tonight's discussion, why don't we spend about maybe 10 minutes just kind of setting the stage of what was happening in April of 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. What were some of the factors and reasons leading up to Dr. King's presence in Memphis, Tennessee, and delivering what would amount to be his final sermon. So why don't we just take a few minutes just kind of discussing that. Any feedback from anyone? No? Okay. I guess I'll get things started. So in 1968 in Memphis, there was a sanitation workers strike that was taking place. I believe there was a tune of about 1,800 municipal workers, and there were all kinds of grievances from workplace safety to fair wages to not having certain benefits as a public employee. And I believe there was a strike that took place earlier that year in 1968. And because the outcome was not satisfactory for these employees, they had invited Dr. King to mobilize and to have these people congregate so that they could make their grievances heard. And during the speech, you'll also see a reference to an injunction. So it turned out that the city of Memphis under Mayor Loeb, he had filed for an injunction prohibiting any protest to take place. So then that is sort of the backdrop. And as we go into the actual speech, there is an outcry about this injunction prohibiting the assembly of people to protest, to seek redress from their government. So that's really the backdrop to all this. I guess we will go into the speech now. And one thing I'd like to do before we start discussing what's in the speech is my kind of interpretation and reading of Dr. King's speeches. It comes from law school. So as I was being trained to be a lawyer, they teach you how to be an effective advocate of your clients. And as part of advocating for your clients, you have to find a way to make your arguments persuasive. So generally in the legal training, there are three, I guess, principles that apply to the art of persuasion. And this traces back to the ancient Greece and their methodology of teaching advocacy. So as we go through the passage, there will be three categories. One is ethos, the second is pathos, and the third one is logos. So again, ethos, that's based on ethics. So do you find the speaker's arguments persuasive based on ethical grounds? And ethics, we're talking about things like certain biblical interpretations and references, as well as metaphors. Pathos really means you're appealing to the audience emotions. And a lot of the ministers and preachers are very effective at appealing to the audience to captivate their interest. And certainly Dr. King had mastery in that regard. And then logos would be something that's logical, as the word suggests. So logos would be something like, we know that violence is bad, therefore violence should not be used. That would be logos. So before we get into the text, some of the questions worthy of further exploration are as follows. So who is the intended audience of the speech? And has he pursued the audience, persuaded the audience? Second question, how does the speech resonate, if any at all, during these dark and turbulent times? Do you find the moral, philosophical, and religious references to be relevant and persuasive? The next question, what or where is this metaphorical promised land mentioned in the speech? Have we as society gotten there yet? If not, will we ever get there? The next question, what are some of the universal and timeless virtues and principles that emerge from the speech? The next question is, what are your impressions about the prophetic finale to the speech, where Dr. King revealed that he's not afraid to die? How does this affect or influence your personal views about death? The next question, does the speech appeal across today's ideological boundaries, namely the left and the right? And finally, do you find his legacy based on peaceful, nonviolent protest to be more relevant than ever? So as we go through tonight's text, let's keep those points in mind and we'll address them as they come up. So we go to April 3rd, 1968. And from the top of the speech, hopefully most of you had a chance to just look over what's in it. He starts out by greeting to thanking Ralph Abernathy. I believe he is another preacher, probably affiliated with the SCLC, which is the leadership council that Dr. King was involved with. And right after that, he goes right into, okay, I'm delighted to see everyone here tonight, in spite of a storm warning. So you could certainly interpret that as it's like the calm before the storm hits. So that right there seems already pretty prophetic in a sense that there's something that's going to happen, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, but that storm is coming. And then he turns the speech from a very dark tone into a storm warning into, well, yet something is happening right now in Memphis. Not only in Memphis, but something is happening around the world. So why don't we pause it there for the time being? Looks like John has his hand up. So go ahead, John.
Yeah, I thoroughly took that to mean there was an honest to goodness National Weather Service storm warning. I don't know that for sure, but that's what I took from his words. Because
yes, that's what it is.
What's that? For those who do know, please let me know. I took from his words that the thing about the storm warning was an honest to goodness Weather Service storm warning that they were braving. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, but that's what I got too, actually. That's what I got too, but I think it's a good analogy what you just did, Thomas.
Yeah, okay.
For instance, whatever was the topic is.
Kind of okay. bookends the speech.
Yeah, I know Sandy has her hand up. Let's go to Sandy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say before we get started, so actually he wasn't even supposed to speak that night. So they arrived in Memphis and he wasn't feeling well. So he asked Ralph Abernathy to go and give a speech to the crowd on his behalf. And Ralph Abernathy went there and saw it was a gigantic crowd. And so he actually called Martin Luther King and said, you know what, there's a huge, huge crowd here. They're here to see you. Can you just come for a few minutes? If you can just say some opening remarks, I'll do the rest of the speech. But they're here to see you. So if you can just put in an appearance. So then Dr. King came and he got up in front of the crowd. And, you know, this wasn't even in prepared remarks that he had. This was just extemporaneous that he pulled all of this out of the air. And it's just so brilliant and prophetic. So it's just all the more remarkable to know he didn't even have a planned speech here and wasn't even supposed to get on stage that night. I actually have been to the Lorraine Motel and the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis because he's one of my heroes. So,
Okay, thanks for sharing that. So in some ways, the ability for him to kind of think on his feet and put a speech together that is certainly historic in many regards at the last minute is remarkable. So I think the reference to the storm could be interpreted in many different ways. It could be surely a meteorological observation, or it could be something more symbolic. But I think sometimes these speeches are really impressionable in that, there could be kind of like a double entendre meaning. And just to go back to Sandy's point, again, here we are, April of '68. And I mean, by this time, there was already a lot of concerns about his safety. And later on in a speech, he talks about, when I arrived in Memphis, even the people who were on the airplane with him were concerned about certain safety concerns or safety for Dr. King. So that's how the speech starts out. Okay, thanks, Sandy. Lorraine, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there may have been a storm, but I think it was more metaphorical for the purpose of his speech. But he does go on to describe having been attacked by some woman in New York. So, and his life was threatened. And I mean, it's a very touching part of the speech as well. But I think the most important takeaway from all of that, not only did he evoke all three, I mean, he managed to do all three of the things you said about the speech. He certainly appealed to the ethics. He talked about storekeepers having, company owners having to do the right thing. He certainly talked about how basically just how wrong it was, how emotionally wrong it was to have all these people treated so unfairly, but also the practical aspect of just having an economic boycott. He managed to pull all of that together in one speech, and that's really impressive because he not only inspired people, he actually had a call to action built in. And I thought that made the speech pretty effective.
That's right, Lorraine. And to underscore all that, he did all that in the name of peaceful, nonviolent movement, which is really remarkable because, again, at the conclusion of tonight's discussion, we'll talk about how that idea doesn't really resonate these days, because when people mobilize, I mean, whether if it's, whatever ideological spectrum there are, when people congregate and protest, it leads to some type of violence, property damage, personal safety. So that's the unfortunate reality. Okay, so again, the speech starts out with this storm warning, and then he says, look, I have this panoramic view of the world. And it's almost like, he jumped on to this imaginary time machine. And God is, allowing me to travel all the way back in time. Let me read you the passage here, and then I'll get to John. It says, a panoramic view of the whole of human history. And the Almighty said to me, Martin, which age would you like to live in? Take your pick, right? What do you think, John? Any thoughts? You're on mute.
He goes through, basically, he makes several stops along the way in the history of Western civilization, which is partly his. And then he chooses the here and now, 1968, and is grateful for it. So I get Western civilization and our shared culture, Western culture, and gratitude is what I get from that. He's expressing gratitude.
Yeah, that's right. Gratitude, wisdom, as well as some, suffering, right? So I guess, I think John's referring to, I guess, this kind of Judeo-Christian tradition that certainly Dr. King is at the heart of. So he starts out with, okay, let's take a mental flight to Egypt. And he makes references to this very dark dungeons of Egypt. So again, for those of you who are not familiar with that history of Egypt, what was going on at that moment? Any guesses? Okay.
This was the Suez Crisis coming up, right?
I'm sorry. One more time, please.
The Suez Crisis?
Um,
Around then, not exactly. Then.
Moses.
yeah, I think
Or,
Moses is a better interpretation.
Yeah.
But Suez might be interesting, kind of,
Sorry, I thought you were
secondary.
talking about during his speech. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
Escaping slavery in Egypt during Moses.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's about the exodus from Egypt, which is, of course, a major theme in African American history and African American religion. The Black religion, the promised land, the escape from Egypt, the wandering in the desert, the promised land. In fact, the promised land is from the mountaintop, and seeing the promised land is a specific reference to Moses at the end of the Exodus before they move into to Israel.
The 12, the 10 amendments. No, how do you call that?
10 Commandments.
The commandments. Yeah. Yeah, it's exactly the Exodus.
Yeah, although 10 amendments are relevant too, because that gets invoked later too. So we'll come back to that as well. Okay. Anyone else?
But it is very specifically, he's referring to Moses because Moses stood on the mountaintop, I think it was Mount Pisgah, and observed the promised land, but he did not make it. Moses died on Mount Pisgah before the Israelites, under the leadership of Joshua, entered into the promised land.
Yeah, so if I could, sorry.
I think God said to Moses, you won't get to the promised land, but you will get to see it. And that's basically what happened to Martin Luther King Jr. too. So.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. We'll get to the final segment later, but basically at the end of the speech, he says, this is God's will. And I'm just telling you, what his vision is. So that kind of has like a biblical reference at the end too. Dallas has his hand up. Go ahead, Dallas.
Yeah, hi. I was just, at this particular point in the speech, yes, the prophetic nature of it, and if you read all the way to the end, it's interesting how it all sort of turns out. But I think at this point in the speech, what he's mainly referring to is the unity of the Jews who are enslaved in Egypt and what they're able to accomplish in freeing themselves during the Exodus in this. And I think he wants to draw a connection to that with the people that he's talking to.
Yeah, that's a good point. So again, as Moses was undergoing the Exodus, there were people kept in captivity as slaves. And there's reference in the speech where the Pharaoh, who would be, I guess, overseeing kind of the supreme ruler of Egypt, the speech says the following. The Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt. So what does he do? Well, his favorite formula is doing the following. He kept the slaves fighting amongst themselves. So if there is a lot of internal fighting amongst the group of slaves, well, guess what? They're not going to unite and have a common cause and be able to come up with a kind of a collective plan to go back to their homeland. And I think later on in the speech, he says, now let us being African Americans in 1968, let us maintain unity. So again, if we are to draw parallels, if you're kept in bondage and captivity and you want to free yourself, whether physically, mentally, or otherwise, well, you have to maintain some unity, have some common goals, and then that's how we will liberate ourselves through reaching to this promised land. I see a hand up from Anat, then we'll go to Rob. Go ahead, Anat.
I'm kind of wondering when he talks about that, what were, I guess, in what way at the time was there not unity among African Americans in the 60s? I mean, I know that there were a few different movements, but I didn't get the impression that they had major arguments with each other. I'm not
Yeah.
sure about that.
Sure, I could address that quickly, and I have a feeling that Ralph might be able to answer that even more in greater detail. So basically the major faction was, do we want incremental change, or do we want the fierce urgency of now, meaning justice delayed is justice denied? And King wanted that very groundbreaking change, and it turned out that the change that he wanted were very basic, which are just things like not being discriminated based on your race, creed, and just be based on who you are. So there was that aspect of it, as well as I think nowadays, as we sit here in 2021, I think King has become a universal person who has near universal respect. But back then, he was not so popular. In fact, a lot of the publishers, talk about cancel culture. They wanted to basically detach themselves from King. In fact, last year we read Beyond Vietnam speech, and that was highly unpopular. In fact, the masterminds of the mainstream media, like the Washington Post, were like, "How dare you criticize foreign policy?" And basically, they were telling King that, well, we only consider you as a civil rights leader. That's the lane that you're going to maintain in. So anyway, so I think if you were to look at his career in that fashion, there were, I guess, the people that followed King's work were not completely unified because there were factions. But Ralph, go ahead. I think you want to add something else to that, right?
Okay, thanks. Yeah. After the Civil Rights Bill of 1960, which at least in principle dismantled Southern segregation, the civil rights movement split into the mainstream movement of Martin Luther King and the Black Power movement. Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam was rising up. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which had been founded earlier on the principle of nonviolence, was moving away from nonviolence. So there was a major group of African Americans who were saying, no, we will defend ourselves with violence if necessary. If we're confronted with violence, we will respond with violence. And Martin Luther King said his position was, no, we must be strictly a nonviolent movement. So I think he was referring primarily to the Black Power movement, the Nation of Islam, and the more radical Black demands.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, I see some other hands. Let's see, Rory, and then Ralph.
I remember back then. I remember the night Martin Luther King was shot, but I think what a lot of people, if you're not my age, but it was very violent because Johnson in the '64 Act, okay, guys, it's all over with. Let's make better now. It was really separated where you would, let's say, if you can think about it conceptually, 50% of the Blacks were fighting and 50% of the Blacks were trying to do something to unify. And then just in general, there was a lot of fighting about everything. No matter where you went, there was violence. And I think what scared people, let's say generally white people, that when the Blacks were, there was a violent faction, and it was very, very violent, and that scared a lot of people. So let's say how you perceive the world right now, it was worse back then. And that's sometimes I think that a lot of people, I could appreciate it because I was there. I remember those things. But my world, I went to school with a lot of Black guys, and we were like, what's the problem? Because we never had it in our circle, but other circles, there was a lot of problems. And if you went down south, you would still think you had slavery down there. And that's why there was so much I think people were trying to bring it together, but there was so much unrest because people were trying to bring it apart from each other. And those were very, very violent times.
Yeah, just to underscore that point, the 1960s are certainly full of high-profile assassinations. JFK, RFK, Malcolm X, Dr. King. Not to mention, there were a lot of protests like the Weather Underground and etc. So, I mean, those were very dark times. So this is why I think this idea of peaceful, nonviolent movement certainly resonates because, there is, I guess, if you were to look at the world back then, there were two camps. Either you're peaceful or you're violent, and there's really no middle ground. Nirav, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll add on the nonviolence point that it was, in addition to a moral stand on Dr. King's part, it was also a strategy where, and he mentioned this in the speech, that when he and his supporters marched, they were doing it nonviolently, and they were met with fire hoses and dogs and beating. And when the news media covered it, like they came out looking like the police looked bad and the protesters looked good because the protesters were not fighting back. So that certainly turned a lot of public opinion in their favor, even though, as you said, King was not necessarily that popular in general during a lot of that time. And in terms of dividing and conquering, or what King was advocating of uniting, I guess just the term dividing and conquering is so popular now. He was, I guess, echoing all of history, saying we need to stand together in order to in order to accomplish our goals. Now, what I was surprised by, and maybe this goes perhaps to the intended audience of his speech beyond just the people in the room, was that if the times that he chose in terms of possible times to live in, so it started off in Egypt, and then it was all Europe. And so it was Greece, it was Rome, it was the Renaissance, it was Martin Luther nailing his principles. So it was Christian, and obviously he was a reverend, but I also think that he was naming areas that white people would find in common with him, and that would be a way to ingratiate himself with the whites who he needed to support him, as opposed to just the Black community that he was directly speaking to that night.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I think that's one way to interpret it. I looked at it a little slightly different, which is instead of trying to ingratiate himself with one group, he's saying that these are the great civilizations throughout history: ancient Egypt, Greco-Roman traditions, the Renaissance, and now here we are, the US. And again, it's a continuation. And later on, we'll talk about some of the guarantees under the Bill of Rights. And basically he's saying, well, what about our Bill of Rights? Why does Bill of Rights only apply to certain people, but not everybody? So I look at it as more of his reflection of history in continuum, starting from, ancient world into now. And he's saying that if we want to continue the traditions, especially those that were endowed during the Enlightenment era, because he talks a lot about natural law and natural rights, then it makes sense that everybody should have the same rights as everyone else. That's an interesting observation. Okay, let's go to Lorraine, then Dallas.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to the concept of unity that he was talking about. There were two other areas that haven't been mentioned so far. One was having people who not give in to either selfishness or fear, and the other was fear. He talks about why you should care, whoever the audience was, why you should care about the sanitation workers. Even if you're not a sanitation worker, why should you care about them? And he brings it back to the part of the Bible with the Samaritan, the Good Samaritan, who says, it's not about why should I help you? It's like, what will happen to you? Not what will happen to me if I help him, but what will happen to him if I don't help him? So I think he was bringing in a biblical concept of not thinking selfishly about yourself, but thinking beyond the broader mankind, and also not to let anyone not to let fear divide either. The fear of getting into trouble, the fear, he says, don't go to school, don't do these things. It's important, and don't let people cow you into not being part of this movement. So I think he was looking for unity on many levels.
Right. So there's a passage in the speech where he uses the rhetoric of, I'm sure most of you know the JFK speech, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. He uses that concept, but he applies this biblical reference to the Jericho Road, which is a very dangerous road. That's where a lot of blood is spilled. I believe they called it the Bloody Road or something like that. And the actual quote goes like this: "The question is not if I stop to help this man in need, what will happen to me? That's not the question. The right question is, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them?" And he makes references to a Good Samaritan and what a Good Samaritan, this kind of, I guess, metaphorical Good Samaritan would have done at that time. And I believe the historical reference to that is it's very dangerous for a Good Samaritan to just stop alongside the road and help someone, because when you do that, well, you're going to have all these thieves and others who are ambushed to come and attack you and maybe rob you. And why would you jeopardize yourself to help another person? That's such a selfless act. But again, this kind of goes to the Christian, I guess, principle of love thy neighbor and treat your brothers and sisters like it's your own. And I think that's kind of that would be more of a pathos argument, kind of like that, appealing to the emotions. I guess you could also say that's ethos too, because again, if you follow certain strict interpretations, then you would say, well, it's my duty, in the eyes of God. I guess that's how King would interpret it. Okay, let's go to some other hands.
I just wanted to mention real quick that the Samaritans were just a different group, that one of them stopped to help him. That's where the expression comes from, Good Samaritan. That one of them, he was not of their group that he helped them. He was from some other group.
Different culture, yeah.
Yeah, somebody could explain that better than me, probably.
John,
there's an additional explanation to what a Samaritan is?
It was just let's see, the Hebrew priest passed him up, somebody else passed him up, Levite, and then the Samaritan. And I think the road is routed in an effort to avoid Samaria in the first place because of animosity between the Samaritans and the Jews. And of course, it was scandalous when Jesus told the story that there was this Good Samaritan who wasn't a Jew. And it was like, how could one of those other people be a good person? So yeah, it's all about, being brave enough to, let down your own fears in an effort to help somebody who isn't like you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, let's go to some other members. Mike, then Ralph. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to add on to Lorraine's kind of speaking to the unity message, and then tying that to what Nirav and you, Thomas, were speaking about regarding who is he appealing to, kind of as he visits these different civilizations. And as you were all kind of speaking to this, I was really amazed by how brilliantly I think he's being very intentional about being anti-tribal. And maybe it isn't so much intention as just habit at this point, it's who he is. But for him to kind of paint this long arc of history, and he brings in these different groups, he brings in the Jews, he brings in the Greeks, the Renaissance, right? He brings in all these different groups, but they're clearly part of the same arc of history. There's no distinction between the different tribes as these struggles are happening. And he lands the audience back to the present day. And it's just amazing to me how effective that is, regardless of what Nirav was talking about. Like, if you're a white audience who's in that present day thinking you're of a different tribe, you listen to that and you're like, no, I'm part of this same, we're on the same train, right? We're going to the same place. And I just think that's beautiful. And I loved listening to the three of you kind of touch on that from different angles.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Dallas and Fabian.
Thanks, Thomas. So I want to build a little bit on what Nirav was talking about around the role of violence in these messaging and this protests, and that, because there's a point in the speech where I think is a great example of the logos that we're talking about, but also is that it sort of talks about the media and how, like today, I think it's the same as it was back then. They sort of reacted to the violence where the message was supposed to be around the sanitation workers, but the window breaking is what got all the press. So the message sort of got lost. And so his point being, of course, you know, violence works against us, not for us. And I think it sort of we infer that the self-restraint is a better way to get things done.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, again, this kind of goes to King's Baptist tradition is, you might recall, if I could just make it like a contemporary analogy and then tie this back to King. Remember during the Democratic Party primaries, Marianne Williamson was running, and one of her, I guess, closing statements during the debate was something along the lines of, when I see my political foe, I sprinkle them with love. And now people are thinking, wow, that sounds like such a new agey, like hippie thing to say, right? Well, okay, that's fair enough. But I think if you were to like apply that concept quite literally, and from, you know, somebody like King's tradition, the way how they viewed, you know, somebody who they disagree with, or they're, you know, somebody on the other side is, well, you have to love them more. It's the deficiency of love that's letting them act on their bad intentions. So the best way to eradicate malice and ill intent is to give them more love, because that's the deficiency. Now, I know that sounds very like kind of flowery and not practical, but that is the tradition that they come from. And, you know, if you were to literally apply how the Baptists and other Christians of that faith view the world, that's really the ultimate approach to how they, you know, deal with these confrontations. Just one last thing, you know, John Lewis, when he, you know, before he passed away, you know, he gave a lot of speeches, wrote a lot of books, and, you know, he came quite close to dying because, you know, again, he was nearly beaten to death with batons. And I'm sure, you know, he probably thought he was having a near-death experience. But even at that moment, he knew that the best hope of trying to show the other side is to just show love. And the best way to express love, again, love not in the sense of like a romantic, you know, I love you kind of way, but in terms of that human interaction, is restraint. And if you could have that restraint, then that's the ultimate expression of love in that type of instance. I know Justin had a question about raising your hand. Oh, looks like Justin got it. Okay, go ahead, Justin.
Someone mentioned earlier that what was some of the bickering between African Americans, and one of the major things was integration and segregation, and many African Americans didn't know how to move forward. Were we going to try to take Dr. King's route and integrate into white society, which I think is, well, it has its issues because cultures definitely need to advance on their own before integrating to a more distinguished culture. I think that's still the issue today also, is a lot of integration. While it's, you know, I'm thankful for it. It definitely has hindered some of the progress to I guess progress everyone. There's the phrase, let me help me so I can help you. And the familial structure has taken a major toll on how African Americans have been functioning in society right now. So definitely integration is good. I'm not arguing against that, but definitely certain cultures do need isolation, a certain dynamic of isolation, not complete isolation. Nobody's completely isolated in the world, but definitely some things were premature in the 60s when it came to integration and moving into a culture that's already distinguished from itself.
Yeah, and I know sometimes it's very controversial to talk about what are the limits of integration. I mean, to what extent do you want to use the state power to enforce integration? And somebody like Barry Goldwater, so that would have been 1964, he said, yeah, I'm all for integration, but I just don't think a top-down approach from the federal government should be the right remedy. Ultimately, if you set the right incentives, and through education and other forces, you could bring about more natural integration, because his, I guess, philosophical view is that forced integration will have blowback. So that's certainly an ongoing debate amongst those who are right of center when it comes to the use of government. Okay, let's go to Ralph and Fabian.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'd like to address the question of violence. Martin Luther King was devoted to nonviolence as a strategy. It was an ideology, I guess Nirav said, as well as a strategy. But there is an approach within the theory of social movements in sociology. There is this sort of question of do you sort of appeal to people's better nature, or do you threaten them? Do you use disruption? And I think there's times and places when both are good. Nonviolence is not always the best strategy. And particularly when they moved up north. So I think Martin Luther King, his nonviolent strategy in the South was very effective. But one thing he almost never admitted, only in one or two cases did he admit that he was deliberately provoking violence. So it was the disruption, in part, it was the disruption undertaken by the police in response to the marches that really got people's attention, that got the sympathy of people in the North, and also got the attention of the business people in the South. When they had when they moved into Birmingham and had a peaceful march, and they had brought out the fire hoses and the police dogs, well, your good white citizens didn't want to go down to downtown Birmingham and go shopping when there was all this violence going on. Now, in a way, Martin Luther King had the best of both worlds. He was non-passive, but his opponents were he was non-violent, but his opponents were violent. So he could have the disruption of the violence and yet still attract people on the basis of nonviolence. One of his early campaigns was in Athens, Georgia, but there Sheriff Laurie Pritchett didn't respond with violence, responded sort of arresting a few people, closing things down, and the movement there was a failure. So he picked Birmingham because he knew Bull Connor would respond to violence, and he picked Selma because he knew that Sheriff Jim Clark would respond to violence. Now, he said, I believe in nonviolence, so he couldn't really say, but I want to provoke violence. But nonetheless, and then following that, after 65, there was the Watts riot of 65. There was the Newark riot, I think in 67, the Detroit riot, and that really scared people. And they said, gee, if our cities are gonna go up in flames because African Americans are angry, maybe we better look at it and do something about it. So violence can be very effective, but it depends on the circumstances and how you manage it. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it just purely from organizational standpoint, again, just take away the ideology, take away the makeup of the members. I mean, it was a pretty brilliant organizational structure, because you want to pick and choose your metaphorical battles carefully. You don't want to just send people out there all the time. That's not the most efficient use of your resources and your focus. So I think in that sense, they're able to do all that grassroots without, the advent of social media. So it's pretty remarkable. Okay, Fabian, then Rory. Go ahead, Fabian.
Hi guys. Yes, I just want to add in terms of like the no-violence. Mr. Martin Luther King was influenced by the Muhammad Gandhi movement in India back in the 40s, 1947, and he actually visited back in the 50s, and that was a sort of a huge impact in his ideology that he brought back to the US. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we talk about the no-violence movement here or in the US. And I also want to add in terms of when he goes throughout this, let's say, historical journey, and then he goes back and forth, and then he sort of settles in these sanitation workers. And it just reminds me of the Republic of Plato's. And he actually mentions the Greek philosophers. And the allegory of the cave, I think it's a really important text when, once you sort of find enlightenment, and then when he says, why do we care about, these sanitation workers? And the whole idea with the Plato's ideology of democracy is basically those who have been able to sort of overcome and come out from the cave, from the shadows, also have to come back to the shadows and sort of lift up their own people, because there is no happiness if there is not, there shouldn't be a happiness what we see nowadays when we talk about the 1% of the population versus, the entire world starving. And so the whole point is, I think what he's doing here, and he does it beautifully, is somehow my metaphor here is understanding that throughout the allegory of the cave. I just think it's wonderful. If you keep in mind what earlier was mentioned, that wasn't really a sort of a speech, since he wasn't feeling well. So I just thought it was beautiful. And I just want to mention those 2 points that I think are relevant. Thank you.
Yeah, the metaphors are really powerful. So again, he starts out from, a trip starting out from the dungeons of Egypt, the dark, dungeons, you're, held in captivity, to the height of ancient civilization, into Mount Olympus, which, if you look at Greek mythology, that is a pretty sacred place. He talks about Parthenon. That's a very kind of religious place of gathering back in the day. And then he also kind of jumps around, and he says, well, don't just stop there. If you stop at Parthenon, well, you're not going to see what's ahead. And he keeps, kind of treading along, goes through the whole Greco-Roman civilization. Then he goes through the Renaissance. And I think I mentioned before how the significance of Renaissance is about the natural rights, but he certainly doesn't stop there. He does a little bit of name checking, like, will the police, real Martin Luther stand up? It talks about Martin Luther, name checking there. And then he goes on to Abraham Lincoln. And then he, I think this is where from Lincoln, it kind of takes a turn into more like an economic populism. He talks about the Great Depression. The passage there is, we come up to the 1930s, where he sees a man grappling with the problems of bankruptcy of the nation. And then I believe this is a FDR quote, which is, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. So again, he kind of zigzags through different annals of history, and that's where we are. Okay, let's go to Rory. Go ahead.
I just like to Ralph, you made an excellent point. And just me, I lived there, we're there. I don't think people appreciate the violence that was going on, because don't forget, back then you had the start of women's lib, you had the start of the gay movements where gays were coming out, and there was all kinds of movements. And every time you turned around, there was something being protested. And back then, Vietnam was very heavy. I mean, I was a junior in high school, knowing I could never go to college until I got rid of my draft requirement. And you have no idea what it was like. It wasn't just me. It was everybody, blacks, white, gray, it didn't matter. If you got a draft card, you were not going to college. So every time you turned around, there was a protest about something. If you went to a college campus, you had the women running around protesting everything. And it was really scary. It really was. I mean, if you think this, what we live today, this is nothing. This is a piece of cake. I mean, I don't know how Ralph thinks about it, but no matter where you went, there was violence someplace. And I think King was trying to circumvent that. He was trying to find a spot in between all of it. Back then, that was very, very hard. It was not an easy thing to do.
I don't know if you want to, Ralph, do you want to respond to that or no? I don't know.
Okay, yeah, just briefly. Yeah, no, I agree with Rory. I mean, remember the gay rights movement? That started with the riot at Stonewall. And it was the riot that got people's attention. It wasn't peaceful protest. It wasn't trying to persuade people that gays were normal. It was a riot that said, oh, yeah, I guess we have a problem here. Maybe we better deal with it. So yeah, violence gets attention, and
yes, it does. And what did the women used to do with the feminists? They would walk around topless. Then you had guys that would say, okay, watch this, we're going to streak. So if you went to, like I went to St. Peter's campus over here in Jersey City, and you had women running around with no bras on, you had guys running around streaking everybody. Then you had other people getting beat up in the street. It was like the Wild West, it really was.
Well, as Bob Dylan said, times are changing. But going back to the speech though, King even says, look, it's not just the US that's messed up. Here's the passage. The whole world is all messed up. And he talks about the nation is sick, trouble is in the land, and confusion all around the world. Yeah, and again, this is at the height of Vietnam conflict. Indochina was certainly unstable at the time. And then just to show you the force of change and uprising that were happening globally, he talks about something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled, whether they are in Johannesburg, in Nairobi, Kenya, in Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis. So again, there were a lot of things going on at that time period. And again, we don't have time to go into every single region, but basically this was kind of the turning point of the world where a lot of these former colonies were getting their independence. There was also a new escalation with the Cold War. So, you have massive number of people, probably like 1/3 of the global population were previously held under some type of colonial subjugation, and now they are finding a new path of independence. So it's a very remarkable time. So anyway, okay, let's see. Fabian has his hand up, or no? I guess not. Okay.
Yes, I do. Here's a question. I hope it doesn't go away from the topic, but since you guys mentioned power, maybe we can leave this to the end, and it's what are your thoughts in terms of power is never given, power is taken, and I just leave it there, based on the reading that we're doing. Doesn't have to be answered.
I just want to elaborate.
I just want to hear some sort of different thoughts in that regard. That's all. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Can you just rephrase that question so that we could bring out later? Power.
It's what do you think about power is not given, it's taken? I cannot sort of give a credit right now. I just forgot who actually said it, but you hear that a lot throughout history, and so I just want to know your thoughts on the subject. That's all.
Okay, we'll address that towards the end as it comes up. So just going back to the speech, because I know we spent quite a bit of time talking about violence, nonviolence.
Sure.
There's a part in the speech, it's about, I guess, 1/3 of the way through. He says, quote, we aren't engaged in any negative protests, and we don't have any negative arguments with anybody. What we're saying is that we are determined to be people. And then he invokes this phrase, we are God's children. So under that premise, shouldn't we all enjoy certain rights and respect that everyone else enjoys? And I think that really has a very powerful reference because, again, if the idea is if we're all kind of created the same in the same mold as God, then why should there be any discrimination whatsoever? Because that by doing that, aren't you also offending the creator that created you? What do you think about that? John, you're shaking your head. Go ahead.
Yeah, A+, thumbs up all the way. That's exactly it. He's being aspirational and positive, and he is lifting up rather than tearing down. And honoring God's creation, which is all of us.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just kind of jumping through the speech here, he does talk about how, Bull Connor and other, I guess, sheriff's officers were using, unleashing the dog, using water hoses. And it seems like the reference here to the water hose almost has like a, like a biblical act of being baptized by water. So instead of them using water hose to, push people away or control the crowd, he's saying that, they'll, in fact, here's the passage right here. And we just went on before the dogs and we could look at them, and we would go on before the water hoses and we would look at it, and we would just be singing, over my head, I see freedom in the air. So it seems like they're kind of, flipping the table around. It's supposed to be something like of a weapon, but he's saying, no, this is, water. I guess it could be viewed in some sense as kind of a purifier, cleanser of that sort. So I thought that was interesting analogy. Okay, Nirav, then back to John. Go ahead, Nirav.
Yeah, so in terms of humanizing Black people, I'm reminded of a common slogan and just like a banner or placard that people held up at the time, which was just "I am a man," and that they did need to remind people that they were human because they were not treated as humans. I put something in the chat, but I'll just make the point here about Bull Connor. So as Ralph said, Martin Luther King didn't really say that he was provoking violence, but that was part of his strategy, and Bull Connor was a big part of it. And I thought that he snuck in a little joke there that it took me a little bit to get, but he said, I turned a bull into a steer. And I don't know how common knowledge this is, but a steer is a castrated bull. So I assume that more of his audience knew that, but I thought that was interesting. And then with the hoses, in terms of treating it as a baptism, I thought that also reminded me of turning the other cheek in Christianity. Of, okay, you're gonna throw a hose on me, okay, keep doing it, or like, get my other side. I'll just treat it as a baptism because it's hurting you more than it's hurting me.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It speaks to the power of the gospel and what God's word can do for us throughout the years. And he also slipped in a little a jab at the Methodists and Episcopalians who just sprinkle the water rather than full immersion in baptism.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Okay. So going back to Nirav's point, again, King is not asking for anything special or extra. All he's asking for is the following: just give all the rights to everybody. And what he says here, and again, this couldn't be any more constitutionally conservative than what he has to say here. He's talking about how there's an injunction prohibiting them from a peaceful protest. So the passage goes like this: we have an injunction and we're going to court tomorrow to fight this illegal, unconstitutional injunction. all we say to America is be true to what you said America would be on paper. And on paper, he's talking about the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. And he then goes to talk about, well, hey, the First Amendment guarantees all these protections, freedoms of assembly, speech, press, yet this exact right is being deprived of us. So Nirav astutely pointed out that sign where it says, I am a man, meaning I am a citizen just like the person next to me. And why am I being treated differently as a second-class citizen? So I think that for me, that point really resonates because, people always invoke the Constitution, and that's great. But I think we should kind of apply that uniformly instead of just kind of selecting certain things that may or may not work in their favor. So, okay. Yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, right quick. And of course, there is a very big difference between the injunction, which sounds to be unfair kind of at the last minute, versus, say, a protest permit. The purpose of the protest permit is not to shut people up. The purpose is to allow the local authorities time to prepare for a large gathering and event in order to keep everyone safe. Most permits are honored. This injunction sounds to me to be like something that was thrown in there at the last minute to try to scare them off, which had it gone on, I would like to think wouldn't have worked. So it does sound to me unfair. And so there you go.
Okay, thanks. Ralph?
Yeah, I want to comment on this question of integration and sort of building up rather than tearing down. I mean, this was the Southern civil rights movement African Americans only wanted to be treated the same as whites. They weren't trying to change anything. They just wanted to be part of the system. Now, by 68, that was going a bit against the grain of political movements. And in fact, his opposition to the Vietnam War was opposing national policy. So there, he wasn't just saying, we just want to be treated the same as everyone else. He was saying, no, what society is doing is wrong. And of course, the other movements in 67, the Black Power movement, which in some cases was a black segregationist movement. No, we don't want to be just part of the white world. We want to have our own world. And of course, SDS was emerging. We want to overthrow capitalism. Whereas the Southern movement was saying, we want to be part of capitalism. We want to be part of materialism. We want to be part of this. But by the late 60s, there was a substantial movement against that. And Martin Luther King was sort of caught between the old movement, the old pure integrationist movement, just do away with any sort of prejudice, and the new movement, which wanted to change society. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ralph. Lorraine.
Yeah, I have a question actually, and I don't know if it's Ralph or someone else who can answer this, but the voter rights registration, was that part of the integration movement? Because I wasn't aware if any Black Power people were interested in voter registration. It just so happens I live on 70th Street, and across the street there is a little monument to, I imagine, one of the 3 civil rights workers that was murdered lived in this neighborhood. And so it commemorates the 3 of them who were murdered for ostensibly just trying to sign up people. So that voting rights thing, which persists today, is still an issue. But that was not ever, to my knowledge, embraced by any of the more militant type groups. I just wonder if you have a comment on that.
Okay, yeah, you're quite right. Martin Luther King, his movement wanted the same rights that white people had. Yeah, that's not exactly what Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X had in mind. They wanted separatism. They wanted their own. They wanted to change society, as well as the leftist movement, the social rights, which would just integrate them into the system. They wanted more.
Yeah, so then he also talks about other nations who have some degree of equality. He invokes Russia and China. He said, well, if I lived in China or even Russia, which is a totalitarian country, then yeah, if they want to remove certain rights under the Constitution, you would expect that. But this is the US, and this is, we have certain guarantees. So I think that's interesting here because the backdrop to that reference is at the height of Cold War, Soviet Union and China and other communist states would use this kind of propaganda saying, hey, you, America, you're saying you're champion of freedom and democracy, but you have this institutional racism, this Jim Crow that's still alive. Well, if you look at us, Soviet Union, we have equality because everyone earns the same amount, whether if you're whatever, race, ethnicity you are, religion, etc. So these communist states during the Cold War certainly use that as a propaganda tool to make them look like they are the true champions of equality and certain aspects of human rights. John?
Yeah, it sounds to me like he's rejecting those systems, thankfully. And once again, expressing what he knew to be the truth that living here in the US, he had a better path to a more just equality. So.
Yeah, that's true. But we also have to keep in mind at that time, when you're a contrarian, when you are criticizing the government, FBI was investigating him. They were trying to see if he was somehow cooperating with, other communist bad actors. And it turns out that they had a, pretty thick profile, pretty in-depth profile on Dr. King because they were afraid that he might be some kind of bad actor who could somehow instigate, communist or socialist propaganda. It turns out it's just the opposite. In fact, we'll go into this later in a little bit where he talks about this kind of collective boycott because of this economic prowess that African Americans have collectively. So that will be coming up next. But for now, let's go to Nirav. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just add a couple quick anecdotes. So to continue your point about the FBI, some of it was about communism, but some of it was just that they were threatened by him because he was shaking things up in a sense. But also you mentioned the Russia and China and propaganda. So not related to race, but within the space race, the Soviet Union, they put a woman into space. And part of the reason for that was that they were seeing what was going on in the US with women's rights and that movement and said, hey, we're to make the exact same point you just made, that hey, we're equal in the Soviet Union. We sent a man and a woman into space.
Yeah, that's right. And if you look at the propaganda coming out of Soviet Union at the time, I mean, it's really, they did a pretty good job. Like they show all these video footages of how, well, in Soviet Union, we have multiple ethnicities and cultures and it's multilingual and everyone gets along, Well, that's just propaganda at that. I mean, it's, the truth is a lot more painful than what it appears on surface. So then he goes on to this kind of a collective boycott reference. So he says, never stop and forget that we collectively, being the African American community, we have the means to come together. And if we were to pull our resources together, we would be richer than other nations, except for, I guess, the top 9 most prosperous nations. So once you take out, the US, Soviet Union, the UK, West Germany, France, then the African American community will be, I guess, the 10th most richest in the world in terms of the accumulation of wealth. He says the annual income is $30 billion. And that's more than the national budget of Canada at the time, which I didn't know, but apparently that's the math that he's using to, again, persuade his audience. So then he says, we don't have to go around cursing at other people. We don't need any Molotov cocktails. Again, his rebuke of violent acts. He simply says, we just need to go around to these stores and boycott some of these stores that still perpetuate Jim Crow. So for instance, he says, go out and tell your neighbors not to buy Coca-Cola, but Pepsi's okay. I'm just kidding. Now, I'm not sure if Pepsi was there at the time, but he says Coca-Cola is like a big, consumer product. So no Coca-Cola, no Wonder Bread. Heart Spread, I'm not sure what that is, but I guess that must have been a big, popular brand at the time. So if you were to just take those brands and just based on the sheer consumer buying power of the African-American community, that would really have a material impact. And they will take notice and say, well, maybe it's time to, be on the right side instead of perpetuating Jim Crow. Okay, Narav, go ahead.
Well, I just add about those companies. The way I interpreted that was that they were local employers. And so that he was pressuring them to pressure the government of Memphis to take his side because his actions would impact them right there. And that may be why, we've never heard of Hard Spread. Maybe it was something that was more regional, and Coca-Cola is based in Atlanta. So that's the way I saw it, at least.
I thought it was about their hiring practices, but maybe I misinterpreted it.
Yeah, it included that. He wanted them to change their hiring practices, but at the same time, he also wanted them to support his cause. Similar to the way that Thomas was saying that the businesses in the city, the areas of the city where there were protests going on, didn't want there to be violence breaking out because it hurt business.
Okay, thanks for that comment. Okay, John.
Yeah, this is huge because what he was saying was take this enormous amount of capital, and more important than the boycott was the boycott. Do business with Black-owned banks, Black-owned insurance companies, and that will take away the customer base from the businesses that engage in unfair hiring practices. And so he's not saying, he's not really saying, put a bunch of people around the store and not let anybody go do business. He's simply making an ask. And that enormous economic power, that $30 billion in income came from free enterprise. No one just gave that money to them. It was earned through work and the free enterprise system. So, those are ringing endorsements for me for the free enterprise system, and he recognized that, and the boycott as a powerful way to prop local businesses up.
Yeah, that's a good point. He talks about how even just within the banking and insurance industry, you could have this kind of bank in movement where you do business with those industries or those companies who are sympathetic to your cause in the name of justice. And he talks about put your money into this tri-state bank. I guess that must have been a local bank. Maybe it was African American owned. And he said, if you were to just do that, that itself would have a cumulative impact that over time, they'll take notice.
Yeah.
So.
And one last point, it's right there in the First Amendment, freedom of association. You are welcome to do your business with whomever you please. And he was, do your business with the people who treat you better.
good point. Okay, so moving on in the speech, here's one passage that I found to be a little very interesting and relevant to this period. It says, "Let us rise up tonight with greater readiness." And then he says, this kind of made me laugh. That's why I want to point this out. It says, "We have an opportunity to make America a better nation." So if you were to apply "Make America Great Again," well, first you have to make it a better nation before you can make it great again. That's logos, right? No? Okay. Yes, Nirav, go ahead. You have your hand up. You're on mute.
I don't know about logos, but in terms of making America great again, it's an interesting reference, especially because like in terms of that movement under Trump, that was harking back to the 1950s, which is exactly what King is trying to move out of and change significantly, and what changed significantly in the 60s.
Well, look, I don't want to relitigate the election of 2020, but I mean, they did have historical turnout for African Americans who voted for Trump. So you can't just all blame it on race.
Oh, no, I'm not blaming it on Trump. It's just an interesting parallel.
Yeah, but I thought that phraseology was interesting because, again, you know, logically, if you want to make something great again, first you have to make it great, right? And right there, we have an opportunity to make America a better nation. So whether if we became a better nation, I don't know, that's, you know, your interpretation, but that's my logos interpretation. Okay, Ralph, then John.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think he wanted to emphasize the fact that he was a good American. He wasn't anti-American. He wasn't anti-capitalist. He wanted to reassure people all they wanted was equality. There were accusations that maybe he was socialist or communist. Some of his, I think Bayard Rustin, some of his people were communists, and he sort of kept them they were his friends and his allies, but he sort of kept them at a distance because he wanted to reassure people he was not a social revolutionary. He simply wanted equality and integration. So he was a good American. He wanted to make America a better place. He was not he didn't want to undermine America. He was not challenging America or American values or laws. Thanks.
Yeah, and just real quick before we get to John, something else that comes to mind when I kind of study the King period, you know, mid to late 60s, is what else was going on in South Africa. You know, Nelson Mandela, you know, he was affiliated with the African National Congress, and they did flirt with communism. So I think there were some concerns with the power establishment that, well, if there are these uprisings in the name of civil rights, well, maybe there's some kind of like a communist agenda behind it. It turns out it's just the opposite, because for the reasons that Ralph just stated. So, but in some corners, they did view this as a national security threat, which turned out to be unproven. Okay, John.
Yeah, he says, "Make America what it ought to be." And I put in parentheses, "live up to its written ideals." And he talked about standing up for the best in the American dream, and frequently mentioned the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and giving the founding fathers full credit. And what I got out of that was aspirational. There was nothing tear down here. It was built. It's all. He's basically appealing to people to build up.
Yeah, that's a good point. Again, I think if you look at the Baptist tradition, which is kind of, you know, his molding, is they do build people up through aspiration, through the, you know, their biblical interpretations. So I think he was being consistent with his, you know, biblical or his background in the Baptist world. And also there was a passage before where he says, look, we're not here to make any negative statements. We're not here to curse at anybody. We're not here to like inflict pain or Molotov cocktails. We want to, as John said, to build up based on certain aspirational goals. So, I mean, to me, that's very remarkable. Okay, anyone else before we move on? Looks like Lorraine has her hand up. No?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I actually ask, was this the first time that an economic boycott was used? I don't really have a historical perspective on it. And I happen to believe very strongly that it's a highly effective way of making a point. It's not illegal. I don't think there's anything you can do to stop people from shopping in one place versus another. And it shows the power of the group. And I'm just wondering if we can credit him with it, or is there a longer stretch back for this?
Yeah, my understanding is that I think the Montgomery bus boycott was very effective too. So I think they were kind of building from past examples, but maybe Ralph or John has
was
some other...
that I'm sorry, I'm talking about an economic, specifically an economic boycott. And I'm sure it probably, but I don't know what the alternative to the bus was. So
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Ralph, John, Mirav.
Okay, yeah, the idea of a boycott, or at least using business pressure, had arisen. As I say, the Montgomery bus boycott was so they either walked or took taxis or did car sharing, ride pooling, and they essentially drove the Montgomery bus system into bankruptcy. And then the bus system finally surrendered because they had too many black customers and they needed the revenue. But the sit-in counter also had a bit of the same thing. The lunch counter sit-ins, the first one targeted, and I guess some of the others, were Woolworths. Now, Woolworth was a national chain, and the northern Woolworth headquarters, and most of their things were in the north, and most of their customers were in the north, and their shareholders. And these people did not like to see this bad press that Woolworths was getting in the south. So so disrupting Woolworths created a thing. But the concept goes way back. Actually, boycott. There was a guy named Charles Cunningham Boycott, I think in Ireland, who refused to buy British products. And then the Boston Tea Party, people refused to buy British tea, and that was a revenue earner for the British. So yeah, the idea of a boycott goes back at least to the American Revolution. And the term comes from that time, the late 18th or 19th century. Thanks.
Okay, John?
Yeah, good. Boycotts sometimes work, sometimes they don't. The main thing is the power of you're making a personal choice and allowing others to make their own choices.
Of course, there was the great boycott of Goya products in year 2020.
Or I have chosen to boycott Goya for the first time in my life. I am now a happy Goya consumer.
Oh boy, yeah. Okay. Dallas?
Yeah. So building on Lorraine's question, kind of, because I was going to say the same thing that Ralph said about the how long it's been since boycotts have been used. They've been used a lot of times in history. But what I wonder though is this is sort of his call to action, and if anybody, what was the next story? You know, what happened next? Considering the following day, the whole world was kind of started rioting. You know, wonder if these boycotts ever amounted, or this call to boycott ever amounted to anything. I don't know, and I don't know any literature about it.
And I would like to know that as well, because wouldn't it be nice if we were taught in school what the result was?
Well, just one of the successful boycotts, and I guess this was also around the same time in the 60s, was it? The grape boycott, when Cesar Chavez was trying to organize the grape workers and in California and trying to get a better deal for them. And he got a nationwide substantial grape boycott, which I think drove the grape growers to allow the unions to come in. I think, as far as I know, African Americans have, other than the Montgomery bus boycott, some of the early ones, it hasn't really been used effectively for racial integration, as far as I know. Thanks.
I just
Hey,
would
hey,
like
Ralph.
to add on to that, that the divesting of South African companies' stocks and investments for anything South African, I thought was pretty highly effective. It seemed like a lot of groundswell around cleaning up portfolios, and especially the kind of portfolios that were corporate. So I think that that was highly effective, but I don't know what happened, for instance, to those companies.
Well, let me clarify my question just briefly, and that's that I'm actually asking about this specific call to action. Does anybody know what happened, considering what happened the day after he gave this speech?
I can't say just in the very short term. I just looked up Tri-State Bank, which is the bank that he mentioned, and it's still around and it has grown. And it was basically, very much related to its involvement in the civil rights movement.
Okay. So then the speech kind of takes a very dark, kind of prescient turn. He talks about his near-death experience. And this is kind of the build-up to the crescendo of the speech. He talks about several years ago while he was visiting New York City to autograph some books. He had a near-death experience. He called it a demented woman, came up to him, stabbed him with a knife, and I believe the blade just missed his aorta just by probably a few millimeters. And he used this this metaphor of, well, if I had to sneeze, again, an involuntary reflexive action, then I wouldn't be here today. And he goes through a whole kind of like call and response. If I had sneezed, the accomplishments that he was able to see during his lifetime wouldn't be there. And then he talks about how he survived that attempted killing incident. And he was recuperating in, I guess, Harlem Hospital. And he talks about how he received all these, get well letters and cards from, various dignitaries, the president, the vice president. And he says, well, I don't care what they say, because of course they're going to say platitudes, get well, feel better. But what he really cared about most is none other than some random, not a random, but anonymous, a ninth grader from White Plains High School. And she says, I just hope you get better. And I'm glad that despite your misfortunes, you did not sneeze to survive. And it turns out that this student, if it matters, it's a white student. And I think what he's trying to illustrate there is that, look, this movement is very powerful. And if what he is doing could convince some anonymous ninth grader, taking a break from doing her homework, let's say, and write a letter to King, then that's a very powerful indication that, people are realizing and taking notice of what he's doing. Any thoughts, anyone? Okay. Well, okay, Nirav, and then we're going to go to the final point here. Go ahead, Nirav.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that he focused on just that one letter as well, as that was the memorable one. And I guess, after the fact, it might have made him laugh that the punchline of, I'm glad you didn't sneeze. Because I guess the rest of it is kind of platitude, similar to what I'm sure we got from others. And the New York Times updated a story about it. They published it today, so I was also reading that, where one of the patrolmen who responded to the stabbing, he died of COVID-19 in November, and it was just giving more of that story of how the stabbing went down. And one of the things that was part of it was that Dr. King said he held no ill will towards the woman who stabbed him. Like it was basically, she was mentally unstable and he wanted her to get the help that she so clearly needed.
Demented Black woman, he described her as.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, I mean, if this were to happen to any one of us, whether if it's a demented person or non-demented person, that near-death experience would have certainly made us think twice about being in a public, but he felt the urge and the compelling reasons to continue what he did. And I just want to go on to the final part of the speech. And instead of kind of reading the passage, I think it's probably most powerful to listen to it. So if you will allow me, I'm just going to do a screen share. And this will be about 2 minutes of the finale of the speech. And it's very powerful. So here it goes.
Thomas, we don't hear your audio.
My apologies. Let me try again.
When you go to share, you may need to check share computer sound. So you may need to stop the share.
Okay. All right. Let me try this again. Thank you, Anat.
The bottom left-hand corner, you'll see two little buttons. You should click on those, make sure it all comes out.
Okay. Thank you. Let me try that again. My apologies. I'm sorry, can you tell me once more where I could find that function?
When you go to do the share,
The bottom
you'll
left.
want to check off the two boxes at the very bottom of the little dialog that shows up when you have to choose which application to share out.
It's
There'll
bottom
be two
left-hand
little-
corner, way in the bottom.
Two check
And
boxes.
optimize for video.
Thomas, do your screen share real fast. Just where you have it set up. We'll show you. Bottom left-hand corner, two little boxes. Okay, yeah, it doesn't come up. No, when you should go back one. You'll see at the very bottom left-hand corner, it'll say screen share and computer sound.
Okay, I'm still lost. Hang on one second.
That's okay.
All right.
So if you stop the share,
Yes.
Click on share screen and don't select anything yet. Just look at the bottom left of that. Yeah, you want to click on share sound as well as optimize for video clip.
Thank you. There it goes.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Okay. Any reactions? No? Okay.
That was that speech, that portion right there there was a lot of speculation back then originally that he knew somehow he was going to die. There was something. It's, you know, did he get a message or, you know, from God? No, but just the way he delivered it. A lot of people right after his assassination said that this was it, and that he had a premonition that something was going to happen. And that he gave this speech, he was able to move a lot of people.
But he didn't move around like you and me. He was a powerful man back then. I don't know about a premonition, but I have to believe that he had a warning about doing his speech the next day.
Well, presumably he had reports from the police or somebody saying that he had received death threats, which is scary for sure. And perhaps he was just, I suspect he just threw that in there just in case.
Yes, that back then, it was shortly there, a couple of days after that, they said he had some kind of a premonition, whatever that is, whatever you perceive a premonition to be, you know, the death threats, because a lot of people were getting shot back then. That was not an uncommon thing to happen. And I think he just like, oh, you know, boy, somebody's out to get me, something's going to happen. And I think that this was his message. If you were able to deliver a message just before you passed away, what would it be? And this was his.
I'm not so sure it was a premonition so much as he was probably getting an enormous number of death threats. Didn't he say somewhere, if I didn't read it somewhere, that they had to hold the plane to, and that they'd spent the whole night guarding the plane because they wanted to make sure it was safe for him. So I think that probably as time went on, he was getting more and more of these threats. But I think the most amazing aspect of that last few minutes of the speech was the preacher was in full display. The power of a incredible preacher. And he really took these people from an audience to on a mission. And he transported them in those few minutes.
Yes, yes.
They were going to follow his guidance. They were going to carry the torch, you know, if in fact he couldn't make it with them. And it does come back to the biblical reference that Ralph had mentioned earlier, where God tells Moses he's never going to see he's not going to live. He will see it, but he won't live in the promised land because for other reasons, didn't want people who had doubted him to go into the new land. But he has transported this audience into being on a mission to carry through beyond his life.
Yes, but that's what they were saying, that the way he gave his speech, the type of charismatic leader that he was, you had this little window this big to make a decision, and he did, and that was it. And that his words lived longer, that video lived longer than he ever will as a person. And I think that was the dynamics of it. That's what brought the movement forward. Because right after that, it started to become a lot more peaceful after that.
Well, not really, because RFK was assassinated the next month. So maybe after that assassination.
Yeah, but they got to right about that time. It was that 68? There was a lot of stuff going on. But right after that, because RFK was shot in California, things started to become a little bit better. Because don't forget, you had like Wallace running around there with the National Guard preventing, you know, the integration of schools, you know, things like that. There was a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, I mean, 68, we had a discussion about that a while ago. It was a very violent year because the Chicago Democratic Party conventions, I mean, that was out of control. So it took a while for things to simmer down. Let's go to Nirav, who has his hand up. Go ahead.
So yeah, I thought it was powerful too. And I can't speak to a premonition or anything like that, but it made me wonder whether he was, since he was basically constantly under threat for the entire decade, it makes me wonder like how often he said things like that, because he knew that it could always just be over immediately based on how much opposition he faced. But it also, when I was reading the speech, I thought it ended kind of abruptly, and then you showed the video, and it did end pretty abruptly. He just walks away, and although he didn't do it, I thought that was quite the mic dropping moment.
Yeah. So again, if we are to use this biblical allegory, again, Exodus, right? Again, it's seeking freedom from captivity and bondage, going to the promised land. And if MLK, according to his speech here, this is God's will. He is Moses. He's been up to the mountaintop. He's looking at the promised land. Two-part question. Have we, well, first of all, what is the promised land? Is it a physical place, or is it more of kind of a state of mind? And have we gotten there? And then the second question is, again, if we are to apply this biblical reference, then who is the successor? Again, Moses said Joshua. So is it Kanye, Obama? I don't know. What do you think? So let's go with Sandy first and John.
Yeah, I mean, as to whether we've gotten there or not yet, I would say no. I think the events of last summer showed that we still have a lot of racial injustice in this country. And I had read a book, maybe some of you guys read it too. It's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And she had a really interesting analysis about how there's always been the system of racial control in America. It just changes forms. So first of all, we had slavery. And then when that ended, people were supposed to be equal, but they kind of came forward and they installed Jim Crow instead. So they just found a new way. It wasn't as bad as slavery, of course, but it still did impose control, and it kept Blacks in a subordinate position. And so Jim Crow lasted for a while. And then the civil rights era effectively canceled out Jim Crow, and things were supposed to be equal, no more segregation, equality. And, there were many improvements from the civil rights era, but again, they found a new way to impose racial control. And so now what we have is the era of mass incarceration, and there's just an enormous number of Blacks in jail, and for very minor offenses often. So, we're really not ready to let go of whites having the power in this country. And so we're not at the promised land yet. And I guess if you want to use Dr. King's analogy, they've moved out of Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea, but they're not in the promised land yet. And it's possible to get there, but the people who have the power now have to be willing to share some of it. And I don't know, it's theoretically possible, but they don't want that wrested from their clutches just yet. So.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I know at the time of King's speech, again, mid to late 60s, when he was active, mass incarceration was, it was still pervasive, and you didn't really hear him speak about that. So I guess the question that I'm wondering is, do you think he would have eventually spoken out about this kind of new form of Jim Crow that you're alluding to?
I mean, yeah, if he was still around, I think he would definitely have done that. And who are his heirs now? I guess like Black Lives Matters is one of his heirs. So people are still pushing for that, but there seems to be a lot of resistance to make changes. And I guess it would still be that way even if he was out there speaking about it.
Yeah, and maybe at the time he was, more focused on voting rights and equal protection. But there's a fascinating documentary on Netflix, 13th, that talks about how the new wave of mass incarceration is de facto another form of segregation, just because of the high number of African Americans who are incarcerated over things like traffic tickets and not being able to pay them, and then next thing you know, there's a warrant out for your arrest and you're incarcerated, what seems like for eternity. So it seems like maybe, hindsight being 2020, but he could have been more forceful on that too, because again, I think criminal justice is also unconscionable. I mean, lack of criminal justice is also unconscionable, and there should be certain rights afforded to everyone. But just, you mentioned about, BLM. Again, we're not going to have a whole debate on BLM, but I mean, there are certain violent factions to the BLM. So do you think he would have spoken out about at least that aspect of it, or no?
I mean, yeah. I mean, to me, the violent faction is not Black Lives Matter. To me, it's other groups that kind of come in and exploit the situation. But Black Lives Matter, the ones I've been to some of those protests, and they speak out against that. And in the news, I see the leaders of the movement speaking out against that. So to me, the violence that was associated with some of those protests, to me, that was not the Black Lives Matters people. That was other people who glommed on and made trouble. And some of them were left wing and some of them were right wing. So,
Well, I mean, right here in Brooklyn, there were, it turned out that some attorneys, licensed attorneys, were arrested with Molotov cocktails, and they were protesting with Black Lives Matter. And, they've done all kinds of, horrendous acts of violence. And again, we just read the passage where King says, yeah, we don't use Molotov cocktails. We don't have any negative messaging or use any curse words. Those were his words. I mean,
yeah,
I think he would have, yeah.
I mean, the leadership of Black Lives Matters does not endorse that kind of behavior with the Molotov cocktails. That didn't come from them. That was these other people who, and I think they even drove here from somewhere else. This was them on their own initiative, trying to bring this violence to the movement. That's not what the Black Lives Matter leadership intended with any of those protests. They wanted it very peaceful, and the ones I went to all were, but I know there were others that weren't.
Okay, let's go to some other members. We'll go in counterclockwise direction. So let's see, Ramsey, then Dallas.
Hey, so I actually kind of just wanted to chime in and echo a lot of what Sandy said about sort of this evolving landscape of racial disenfranchisement and racial disempowerment and control in America. In college I studied a lot of what she's talking about, the school to prison pipeline, how Black communities are consistently and uniformly more policed than white communities, even though like in a lot of cases, especially for drug offenses, which is like one of the number one leading causes of incarceration for young Black men. I'm so sorry, I keep getting text messages for young Black men. It's a lot of studies have found that like white and Black communities use drugs to the same degree. Basically, it's just that Black communities are much more policed, and they tend to get caught using illegal substances more so than their white counterparts. However, I also wanted to chime in that there's also another form that we find in of racial control in this country, and a lot of that. And I know you don't want to relitigate the election, Thomas, but a lot of the rhetoric around voting rights and the the push on the right for voter ID laws is in a lot of the ways I think racially charged, and has its roots in a little bit of racial control. It was saddening to see that this past election cycle, a lot of the votes that were called into question just happened to be votes from heavily Black urban areas like Philadelphia and Detroit and Atlanta. And there was a sort of this rhetoric you saw on the right of casting those votes into doubt as like less legitimate. And they just so happen to coincide as like mostly Black voters. And this is not a thing that just happened this election cycle. It's something that's been happening for at least 10 years. Voter ID laws tend to disproportionately disenfranchise minority voters, people of color, from voting because they don't, among people of color, they don't necessarily have the same forms of identification as white voters do, like passports or driver's licenses. Like a lot of people in the, a lot of African Americans, at least I think on average, and obviously this is me not knowing perhaps, but I mean from what I've heard, a lot of times like people of color don't necessarily have driver's licenses because they don't have cars, or if they live in the inner city because they just like walk everywhere, and they don't have passports necessarily, they don't necessarily travel a lot by air. So it's saddening to see a lot of this push on the right for voter ID laws because it's to combat what is essentially a non-existent problem because voter fraud is exceedingly rare in this country. And it's a lot of ways, it's another form of racial control. It's another form of trying to disenfranchise minorities because they don't necessarily vote Republicans. So it's just a saddening turn of events that we still are trying to and you see cases like Shelby County versus Holder that guts key essential parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1964, which was a big piece of landmark legislation during Martin Luther King's time that ensured that African Americans had a right to vote in this country. And you see cases like that gut key parts of that legislation and allow states to pass very harsh voter ID measures. And it's sad that we're still fighting the same battle. Is this essentially what I'm trying to say? That even in 2021, 2020, and 2021, we're still fighting for Black votes and Black lives to matter.
Okay, thank you for those comments. So according to what Ramsey just said, it seems like the systemic and institutional disenfranchisement and underrepresentations of African Americans is a barrier of entry to the promised land, to reaching the promised land that King envisioned. Here's what I'll say, and that's a perfectly fine statement. I think, again, if we go back to this kind of biblical reference that we talked about Moses going up to the mountaintop, seeing the promised land, and kind of carrying that torch and continuing from ancient Greece all the way to the US. If King were alive today, he would be like probably in his early 90s, right? I think his main ideological foe would be somebody along the lines of Chief Justice John Roberts, because Ramsey had mentioned the Shelby County versus Holder case, which kind of gutted the Voting Rights Act. And if you look at the rationale given by Justice Roberts, he's like, look, times are different. Since the 1960s, there were a lot of improvements and remedies put into place. And there's also other cases where Chief Justice Roberts says, if we're going to eradicate the ugliness of racism, then we got to stop being fixated on racism. That seems to be kind of the polar opposite of what I think King would be a proponent of. And it would be really interesting to see how that ideological back and forth would play out. But
Roberts' reasoning can be summarized as racism is over. Let's get over it. It's completely ridiculous.
All right, fair enough.
I mean, from my perspective.
No, that's fair enough. But again, let's go back to the text that we read tonight, because he did talk about along the way from this, metaphorical journey back into time. He did mention the Renaissance and Martin Luther. So again, if we were to apply this biblical interpretation, maybe there is a branching out of getting to promised land where, the King's, pathway to promised land is what Ramsey had mentioned. But maybe somebody like Roberts thinks, well, there's another way to the promised land. And that's his view. Again, that's another kind of branching out, kind of like how Martin Luther branched out from the mainstream, tradition of Christian faith. So again, if you were to apply the analogy, I think you could certainly compare it in that sense. But I do want to get to some other members here because we need to wrap up soon. So let's go with Dallas, Ralph, then Rory. So go ahead, Dallas.
Yeah, hi. Let me just bear with me for a second while I propose possibly an alternate universe. And that's that, what if the promised land isn't a state of mind where every problem is solved and everybody's happy? But the promised land that King was talking about was one in which the people on either side of the argument was mixed, where you didn't have Black people versus white people, but you had people talking about this where you had Black and white people on both sides of the argument. And I'll call out a fact that Thomas, I think you pointed out earlier, is that a record number of Black people in this election voted for Trump. So this is this possibly illustrates illustrates a little bit about what I'm talking about. And to kind of wrap that up, I want to, if you read your Bible, you'll know that, the Hebrews entering the promised land was not the end of the story. It was really only the beginning. And there was an awful lot of suffering that happened after that. So I think, I'm going to propose that we have indeed reached the promised land. We've also elected an African-American president. We have people on both sides of this argument, and we don't necessarily see the argument split by color. It is about color to some degree, or to a large degree, but it is not being argued by the colors on either side. So I propose that maybe we're at the beginning of our entry into the promised land.
So this is the beginning of the end, right? Just kidding. No, that's a very pessimistic view of it. Okay, but I think if we were to apply Dallas's logic, then once we enter the promised land, there's going to be a whole host of challenges and suffering that we're going to face, right? I mean, that's just part of, life and natural cycle. Is that what you're?
Life goes on, yeah.
Okay. But it seems like John is shaking his head no. So let's go with John, then Ralph. Go ahead, John.
I'll cede my time to Ralph because he was called out before I was, because I accidentally lowered my hand. But I'll talk if you want me to.
Go ahead. Go ahead, John.
Just piggybacking off of Dallas, the promised land I believe King was referring to was as close as we possibly can get to living up to the ideals established in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, with the necessary and proper laws that apply to everyone. And the promised land is not a perfect place. It's like an asymptote in mathematics. The graph gets close to it, close, but never actually gets to it. We will never have perfection. We are in the promised land now. Race relations are better than they've ever been. It's cyclical. They go up and they go down. There are flare-ups here and there. It's never going to be exactly perfect until the final, the New Jerusalem, which Christ promised. So we're there. What's seriously wrong, and King alluded to it in his speech when he mentioned that the press only looks at the broken glass and not the people cleaning up the mess after Ferguson every morning. King has no successor. All of his would-be successors are cashing in and lining their own pockets. And the press is lying to us. Community leaders are lying to us. They know that lying and keeping people in fear is a way to gain control of their hearts and their minds. And I refuse to participate in that. Things are better than they've ever been. Flare-ups happen. Things are cyclical. And so I asked people to consider looking at the New York Times Fatal Force report. They've been keeping a database since 2015 on police shootings. And on a yearly average, there are roughly twice as many whites killed at the hands of police than blacks. And then there's a big chunk of unknown. And so, but some people who want to agitate and want us to believe that things are worse than ever will only focus on that thing about percentage of population, disproportionate. And by golly, you hear this disproportionate thing. Guess what? There is no perfection there. This disproportionate thing is designed so that there is no solution. And a real honest, godly solution is where we come, as close as we can, and things go up and down. And we want the law to be applied equally. But, and we try to fix things as we go along. But the press, community leaders, are lying to us. Even in the Seattle Times, back in the summer, a prominent minister wrote a column, and long after it was well known that the young woman who was tragically killed in Louisville earlier this summer was out of bed, up and dressed when she was tragically struck by a bullet. She said in her column that the woman was asleep in bed. It was a flat out lie, and words matter. And words like that are designed to keep people agitated and angry. So King has no successor today. His would-be successors are, unfortunately, people who thrive and depend for their, influence on lying and keeping people in a state of agitation and fear. We are in the promised land, and it's up to each one of us to strive to live up to the ideals in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. And of course, it starts with me. I have to allow. The most powerful thing I can do is allow for people to assemble, allow for people to say their piece and not censor them. To try to censor others is a power grab, but it comes from a place of weakness. We've had some censorship where government is forbidden to do it. Private entities have, from a position of weakness, have tried to be powerful, and they are not. So, I want people to live their lives freely and with liberty that our founding fathers promised. I didn't make that up. It was bequeathed to us. It is up to me to honor that promise for everybody else.
Okay, thanks, John. Just real quick, and then we'll get to other members. Even if we have entered into this metaphorical promised land, if we were to go back to the text from the speech, there's this pattern where a king says, okay, I've seen the great Roman civilization, but I'm not going to stop there. I've seen the great, Renaissance. I'm not going to stop there. So what he's saying there is the dangers of complacency. So if you think that you have achieved the status quo that is comfortable, don't rest there. Keep moving, because there are certain universal things that we all have to attain. And this is just my kind of counterfactual guess. But even if we believe that some degree of racial justice was achieved by means of entry into this promised land, I truly think that King, to his tradition, would have been kind of like economic justice warrior. I think he would have really been like a champion of certain economic reforms, because in the later part of his career, he really focused on, the working class struggles and, the people's labor concerns and etc. So I'm just not convinced that he would have said, okay, now we've achieved this, state of nirvana, if you will, or the promised land, and we stop there. I think he would have kept on going. That's just me, but because he does use like expressions like the fierce urgency of now, and I just can't imagine him saying that. Well, we have the first African American president. Okay, guys, just take a deep breath and we'll be fine. I think he's more of a kind of a person that always pushes the envelope, so to speak. But I do want to get to some other members. So let's go with Ralph.
Thomas, I'm sorry, you twisted my statement a little bit when you said that the promised land is a state of nirvana. My point was exactly the opposite of that.
All right, I wasn't referring to your interpretation. Sorry, Dallas. I mean, I was just trying to provide different I guess interpretations of it. I know, Dallas, you had another interpretation of it, but some people have different interpretations. So I wasn't attributing that to you had mentioned.
And right quick, I assure you, I wasn't advocating for complacency. Always vigilant.
Sure, absolutely. Okay. In the interest of time, we're just going to get to the final four hands. So again, Ralph, thanks for being patient. Ralph, Sandy, Ramsey, and then Rory. So go ahead, Ralph.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, I agree with Sandy and Ramsey. Now, we certainly haven't reached the promised land, and certainly not King's promised land, since he was in 1968, was sort of still hoping to reach the promised land. But in fact, his civil rights movement, what we call the classical civil rights movement, is usually dated from 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott to 1965 with the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. There's actually been very little progress towards racial equality since 1965. Between 65 and 68, as Thomas says, he was moving on towards a broader social justice agenda of reducing poverty, and that just hasn't happened. In fact, poverty inequality has increased a great deal over the last 40, 50 years. So, and in fact, some of what he accomplished, as people have mentioned, the 65 Voting Rights Act has been partially reversed or substantially reversed or gutted. Disenfranchisement. There was one of the judges on some of the recent redistricting noted that some of the redistricting had been drawn on racial lines with almost surgical precision. So the disenfranchisement is clearly racial. I would certainly agree with John that there is no successor, that basically after 65 and certainly by 68, the movement, the civil rights movement, was kind of dead. There's been almost no progress since then, and it sort of broke up into the Black Power movement, which had rather different goals. And then you had the anti-Vietnam War, and of course King was turning against that, and the civil rights movement just sort of broke down. I guess the Black Lives Matter movement is to some extent a new wave, perhaps, of the civil rights movement. Now, King's promised land, I think, at least was partly just racial equality. And then he was moving on to a broader social justice. But if we take racial equality, if we really did have a society where blacks and whites and other groups were equal, then then we would have proportionality. We'd have the same proportion of whites and blacks in prison, being shot by police, involved in crime, if we had a genuinely racially equal country. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks for those comments. Let's go to Sandy, Ramsey, and then Rory. Go ahead, Sandy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's pretty clear that Black progress has stalled out in recent years. And we've talked about how racial equality has been a problem and that hasn't made a lot of progress. And there's also the whole issue of economic, inequality. And I guess Ralph touched on that a little bit and you touched on it, Thomas. And, all the economic analysis shows what a problem there is. There's a small subset of Blacks who've had upward mobility, but for the majority of them, it's really just been flat. And it's very easy, even if someone climbs out a little bit from poverty, it's very easy for them to get pulled back in. So whatever we're doing has really not helped to lift Blacks out of poverty. And until we do that, things are not going to change for Blacks in this country, because having, economic power gives you a lot of political power too. So we really have to lift people up economically if we want anything to change. And then as to the point of, whether or not we've reached the promised land and if we have achieved racial equality and all that, I think it's not for white people to decide. That's for Black people to decide. And I don't even really want to hear too many white people's opinions about it, because white people have a stake in continuing the injustices that have gone on for hundreds of years in this country. So I don't care if white people think we're there yet. It's not their decision to make. It's what Black people think about whether we're there or not. And most of them would tell you that we're not. So I'm going to go with the Black opinion on how we've done.
Although, Sandy, I think in the spirit of what King was proposing, don't you think he would want to have everyone's opinion count? Again, he goes out of his way to say, look, there was a letter from some high school student, a white student, she's wishing me well. So I don't think he would want to just simply remove a certain group of people in terms of having their input as to how we could somehow, collectively as a society, view ourselves. I think he would take a more kind of a wholesome and more inclusive approach. And I think that's really his Baptist tradition. What do you think?
I mean, yeah, he wants everyone to buy into it as much as possible because that's how you really make true progress that's deep and lasting. It isn't just going to get reversed when someone else wrests control of power. So it's better to have a consensus where, you know, the majority of the whites want to see progress for the blacks too. And we're kind of getting there, but you know, clearly, as some of the comments here tonight show, some people aren't even willing to understand the situation and to help out with it. So that's a shame.
Okay, thank you. Ramsey, you're next.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to echo a lot of what Ralph and Sandy just said. I mean, I totally get where Sandy is coming from when she says that like it's definitely a thing for Black people to decide. That's not to say that we should discount white people entirely from the conversation, but I think it is to say that white people shouldn't have the determinative say of like, oh, we're at the promised land, like, or that they should discount, like, you know, when they hear instances of Black people recounting how our society is still very much racist, that white people should not definitely should not be dismissive of that, as I've seen a lot of people dismissive of. And I'm not talking about this group, but I'm talking about like the Black people, the responses I've seen to the Black Lives Matter protests. What to John's point, I'm not saying, I don't think people are saying that things haven't gotten better since 1865 or 1965. I'd say that you could argue from certain perspectives, yeah, things have definitely gotten better in race relations. However, it's still not great. It's still, just because they've gotten better doesn't mean that they're good. I think that you could argue in a lot of ways, it's more so of a devil you don't see as opposed to 1963, where it was a devil you did see. It was just because it's not overt and out there doesn't mean it doesn't exist. For example, like we were talking about the criminal justice system, the Sentencing Commission, the U.S. government commissioned a study in 2017 that found that Black men receive prison sentences that are about 19% longer on average than their white counterparts, and that's not even taking into account past histories of violence for many of these offenders. It's just a completely based on racial lines. Black men got almost 20% longer sentences. Also, Black men are 6 times more likely to go to prison than white men are. Hispanic men are about almost 2.3, I think, or 3 times as likely as white men to go to prison. So again, it's just like, I think people have attached the attitude that because it's not overt out there, because you don't see, you know, lines or signs that say whites only or no colored people allowed, that, you know, we're in a promised land. And I don't think that that's the case, because if we were truly, I think if we were truly in a promised land, we wouldn't still have to be fighting this battle. It's not that there hasn't been progress made, it's that there hasn't been enough progress made. And when we saw the Black Lives Matter protesters this past summer, it wasn't the fact that they were like, oh, we have to fight this battle again. No, a lot of people were saying the fact that we are still fighting this battle is a mark on our country. I mean, let's be honest, I think in the developed worlds, the United States might have one of the worst track records on race relations and on treatment of people of color, you know, as compared to certain other developed countries. I'm not saying that, not to say that the United States is like has the worst track record, but I wouldn't say that we are, I wouldn't say that the way the U.S. treats our people of color is necessarily a model.
Okay, thanks, Ramsey.
hold
We
down.
gotta wrap it up. So it seems like Ramsey would subscribe to another famous quote by Dr. King, which is, "Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere." Do you think that quote kind of applies to or summarizes what you were just saying just now?
I mean, yes, in a way. And then just one more thought. Like, I mean, there is a reason why there was some truth to the statement that, I guess, yeah, I don't know. That's not necessarily what I was saying, but I just like there is the idea that we're in the promised land, I think, is ignoring some of the major faults in our society that still persist.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Rory, and then I see Nod has your hand up too. So go ahead, Rory.
I'll be quick. Tonight, when I was thinking about this meeting, if Martin Luther King was here right now, what would he say? What would his interpretation? What was his views? Because if you look at Black Lives Matter, there's no way that you could say King would have been ascribed that to that. It's peaceful. He was all peaceful. I grew up there. I saw it. I was there. But Sandy and Ramsey, it's when you talk, you say, it's not enough. It's not enough. Well, what is enough? When is enough? Now, Dallas has suggested maybe we entered this promised land. You don't want to say it, that's okay. But now you're in the promised land. Now you have to jump in. Now you have to be a part of it. You can't be somebody who takes from it, because everybody has to contribute to it. The reason I say that is I work for Verizon. I'm essential. The fire department will not go into a building unless I'm there. And we now have women who have circumvented that. You can honestly say women are now part of the mainstream in my business. Maybe not all businesses, but my business it is. But they're a part of it now. They became a part of it. They came up the same way everybody else did. They came up, they moved up, and they're in it. But where do you say we didn't do enough for Blacks? And it's like, okay, what else do you want us to do? Now with the women went through a natural progression because that's just the way the business is, but they circumvented that. They went to school for it. They became construction engineers. They became electricians, but they're moving into nirvana. We all arrived at the same place. We're all here, but everybody has to take a step to say, okay, it's my turn. I want to do this. I want to contribute here. But you just can't say that everybody, the poor Black guys, the poor Black guys. Well, maybe it's time that everybody gets to nirvana, and maybe everybody has to stand up and say, I'll do this. I'll take care of this. I'll go in this direction. And it's time to say, I have to contribute to nirvana. And I think that's what a lot of people are saying. I think you're missing the point of it, which is okay. You have your opinion about it, but there has to be a point where you enter it and everybody starts to contribute to it. And that's what you just don't see. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rory. Just 2 points of clarification. I think nirvana is probably not the best expression because that deals with Buddhism, and we're talking about his Baptist faith, because I'm sure the late Kurt Cobain is just, crawling in his grave. How dare you defame Nirvana, the band that is. Anyway, that's a Seattle reference for you, John. But I think the bigger point, since Rory asked a rhetorical question, what more do we need to do as a society? Well, here's a passage from King's speech from tonight. Again, it's that Good Samaritan, rhetorical question, which is, the question is not if I stop to help this person in need, what will happen to me? The right way to ask the question or frame it is, if I do not stop to help these people in need, then what will happen to them? Again, that would be his kind of rhetorical comeback to the question that you posed. But then Rory's going to say, well, what's the limit? When do you reach that state where there is no longer the need for that Good Samaritan act of selflessness? I don't know what the answer is, but again, I think that's how King would respond to your question. We have time for one more comment or question, and that will be the final one from Anat. So go ahead.
Oh gosh, I wasn't planning on being the final comment. I have a lot of thoughts going through my head. Before I let's see if I can really formulate what I want to say. First of all, I think that the idea that we should only look to the opinions of any one group kind of suggests that that group is monolithic in the way they think, in the same way that, you know, white people on this call don't have the same opinion. I don't think Black people altogether are going to agree on whether or not we're quote unquote in the promised land. So that's the first thing. The second is that some people have presented proportionality arguments, and generally, I mean, most phenomena are not caused by one thing. So usually I appreciate a multivariate analysis. So for example, in my field, there's a claim that, you know, that not enough women work in my field. And because it's, you know, it's not 50-50, and therefore there must be tons of sexism. But the truth is that there are a lot of factors contributing to why women don't work in my field that really have nothing to do with sexism. So I would want someone to go and say, okay, fewer women are choosing to study this thing. What are the reasons? Maybe it takes a long time. Maybe they choose to have children. Maybe this isn't a topic that interests them. Maybe they, you know, why are they paid less? Maybe they choose to work fewer hours because they have other priorities, etc. It's not always black and white. And you can say that they've been culturally influenced if you want. But the point is, I would want someone to say, okay, 2% of this difference that we see is attributable to that factor, 3% is attributable to that factor. And then finally you get down to something that's unexplainable, and you might posit that that is sexism. So I find it difficult, you know, when people talk about proportionality, I feel like they're just focusing on one thing, and it really doesn't reveal what's going on fully. So that's sort of that's sort of how I feel about that. And then I've already forgotten my last point, but I don't think that I don't think that, you know, it's like there's a black and white answer. So I'll stop there because I don't want to go on forever, but thank you.
Good job, Anat.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Anat. I think King's response would be this. Yeah, fair point. These are the realities of the complex world that we live in. But he does make references to children of God. And again, if you apply his analysis, all of us here, whether you believe it or not, are children of God. That's what he says. And he would expect all of us to have certain opportunities that others would have. No one should be deprived of the opportunity, whether if that results in some kind of like a proportional or mathematical equality. I don't think he's proposing that. I think he would certainly say that all of us should certainly be able to live up to certain potential that the Creator endowed upon us when we were put on this earth. So I think that's what he would say. Do you have a final comment that you were able to come up with, Anat, or is that it? That's it. Okay.
No, it's okay. I'm happy to talk about that another time. So
Okay,
thank you.
sure. All right, well, this will be a good place to leave it. So thank you once again for joining us tonight. It's a
Good
fascinating
discussion, all.
discussion. Yes.
Thank you, Thomas.
Very
Well,
good discussion. Thanks,
You
Thomas.
know, I'm glad that we're all here to at least celebrate the legacy of King, because he left us with plenty to think about and discuss. So hopefully we could all meet again next year for another King Day celebration, and let's find another speech. And there's plenty of them. So I look forward to that opportunity next time. So thanks once again. Be well, guys. Good night.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night.